Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending the closeout event at the Raintown Museum for the 135th United States Culture. We want to thank the museum for putting on this exhibit, which opened in February. I understand it's been very successful. I'd like to acknowledge the city manager, Tim Salmon, here today. Councilwoman Hiawatha Jones, welcome. And now I'd like to acknowledge the reenactors who are going to post the colors.
Squad, forward, halt.
Thank you very much. At this time, we have the distinct honor, and I do, of welcoming United States Congressman Butterfield to give some comments in closing out this event at the Raintown Museum. Congressman Butterfield.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so very much for allowing me to come and spend this time with you this afternoon. I want to confess that this is my first in-person public event in 14 months.
Wow.
But when I got the invitation to come, I said, why not? He told me that we would be socially distanced, and the governor says we're coming out of this thing, and the president has a lot of protocols in place now, and I just feel comfortable. So I thought I would come today to be a part of this very, very important program. Thank you for recognizing the valuable contributions of the 135th many years ago. I am a student of history. I'm not an expert by any means. I am an amateur. I was on the phone the other day with the Librarian of Congress, the top person at the Library of Congress. He's called the librarian. I was talking with her, and she had one of her staff members on the phone, and we were talking about history and all that. And I said to the young man who was on the phone, I said, I'm a jackleg historian. Do you know what that means? And he got very, very quiet and said, no, sir, I don't know what that means. And that's when Carla Hayden, the librarian, said he means amateur. And so I'm an amateur historian, but thank you for recognizing this history. This is very, very precious and important history that must be preserved. I know you're going to hear a lot about the 135th and the U.S. colored troops and all of that, but I just wanted to take the 3 or 4 minutes that have been allotted to me to talk about the history that surrounds the work of these brave men. The year was 1857. There were 4 million slaves in the South. Many of those were right here in Wayne County, Johnston County, Greene County, Pitt County. There were 4 million slaves throughout the South, and right here in North Carolina, there were some 300,000 slaves. And those slaves were living under some very, very difficult circumstances. And because of that, whites in the North organized an abolition movement. They felt that it was morally wrong, that it was against God's teachings to enslave and to put people in bondage and to keep them in bondage. And so the abolition movement was alive and well in the northern states. And Southerners became very fearful that the abolitionists would prevail, that they would get the attention of the world on the cruelty that was being imposed here in the southern part of the United States. And so it was a very tense moment. And so in 1857, a question was presented to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanders. The Dred Scott case was all about what rights do black people have in this country. Dred Scott had been a resident of Missouri, which was a slave state. He stayed there for 10 years, and then he moved over to Illinois, which was a free state. And then Dred Scott came back to Missouri. The question then became, what was his status? Was he slave or was he free? And Dred Scott challenged his status and took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court made the following pronouncement. A Negro, this is a 7-2 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the United States and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, cannot be an American citizen. The court went on to say that just by moving to a free state and moving back does not emancipate Dred Scott. Slaves are property under the Fifth Amendment. That was the holding of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857. That outraged the abolition movement in the North. It absolutely enraged them. And they were now determined to do whatever they could to bring slavery to an end. Abraham Lincoln was running for president in 1860. The year before, he had made a pronouncement in a very publicized debate that said that the nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And because of that statement, Southern slave owners, plantation owners, were very fearful that if Lincoln was elected, the first thing he would do would be to take away their slaves. And so there was an election in November of 1860, and sure enough, Abraham Lincoln won the election. Immediately following Lincoln's election on whatever day it was, November of 1860, immediately several states, 11 states, ceded from the Union. And I brought a list down with me if I can just find it. Here it is. Right after the November 6, 1860 election, 7 states immediately, like within 5 weeks after the election, even before he was sworn in, 7 states ceded from the Union. South Carolina was the first. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And then Lincoln takes the oath of office. He was sworn in March the 4th. Back then, the inauguration was on March the 4th and not January 20th. He was sworn in on March the 4th. And immediately, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, 4 more states leave the Union. Now we have 11 southern states who have ceded or succeeded from the Union. And they are trying to set up their own country. They're calling themselves the Confederate States of America. They adopted currency, elected president, they elected vice president, and they stood up a military, the Confederate States of America. And so there was a lot of tension. Lincoln is now president. There's a lot of tension between the United States and the southern states that have succeeded, and are rebelling against the Union. And that's when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. You perhaps know that story. Brutal civil war erupts. I don't like to call the Civil War a war between the states. It was a war by the southern states against the Union. That's That's what it was. Brutal Civil War era. African Americans could not serve in the military. They could not serve in the military. Lincoln and U.S. Grant and the others did not want African Americans serving in the military. We wanted them in support roles, but not on active duty. But in 1863, it appeared that the Union was losing the fight. And they needed more manpower in order to save the Union. And Lincoln then agreed, and the Congress agreed, to allow African Americans to enlist into the Army. And that they did. They did it in very large numbers. 175 regiments were stood up over a period of 2 years. 178,000, not 178,000, 178,000 African Americans enlisted into the United States Army. It was about 10% of the force. About 10% of the Army consisted of African American men. And because of that, the whole fate of the war took a turn in favor of the Union. And that's when Sherman was able to go into Atlanta and seize Atlanta. And that's when he started this famous March to the Sea. And that's when 62,000 men followed Sherman. Another 60,000 went in the other direction. But 62,000 men followed Sherman all the way down to Savannah. On the way to Savannah, Sherman's strategy was to wreak havoc, not to destroy cities, but to destroy homes and to destroy farms and to take away the livestock and the animals that belong to the local people. The whole purpose of this destruction was to demoralize the enemy. Not to kill the enemy necessarily, but to demoralize the enemy. And it worked. And Sherman got to Savannah, and then he was ordered to come back to Virginia to have a battle in Virginia. And that's when Sherman disagreed with the orders and said, no, I want to take the same concept that I've used in the March to the Sea. I want to now have the Carolinas. I want to focus on the Carolinas. I want to go up to Columbia, South Carolina, because that was the first state that left the Union. And we want to go and conquer Columbia. And so he took all these thousands of men. And that's when the Pioneer Corps, African-American men were part of it. That was the Pioneer Corps. And they went ahead of the troops and they started building highways and passageways so that the troops could get their wagons and their other supplies through. Took it to Columbia. Then they came across Lumberton and came on into North Carolina. And you know where they ended up, right where we are now, right here in Goldsboro. And they came to Goldsboro. They came here. This was a meeting point. This is where the regiments from the north were going to meet up with Sherman's army here. And then they were going to continue on up to Petersburg and Richmond and Fredericksburg and Alexandria and eventually into Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of history surrounding this. And so it is so appropriate that you would take a moment today to pay tribute to these great men, and some of you may be descendants of those great soldiers, to say thank you for many, many years of service. There's much more to this story, but I think I'm going to stop right now. But thank you so very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Congressman Butterfield. That was really great. I think one of the major points we need to take away from that is that, these men that became part of the Pioneer Corps and then part of the 135th, they were volunteers. They weren't ordered to, they weren't slaves anymore. They were free now, and they volunteered to be part of the United States Army. They could have volunteered to do something else, but they volunteered to help Sherman move his troops along the path. And we found that they're one of the only African-American regiments to march in the Grand Review on May 24th, 1865, which is very key. Did you want to say? Okay. We got started on the path researching the 135th about 5 years ago. And we've spent a lot of time traveling back and forth to Washington, D.C. and the National Archives and reviewing the men's pension records. Each pension record tells its own, very unique story about the men, where we learned a lot about how these people live, their backgrounds, their families, and it's really been an interesting trip. And to have this event here at the museum for the last 3 months is really special, and we feel very grateful, Jennifer, for having this event. Thank you. Oh, and that's right. And Bernard George is here, and I'd like to introduce him now. He has a little story to tell. Bernard?
Good afternoon. It's always a hard act following Congressman GK Butterfield, GK Butterfield. And he is a historian, as you can hear. As I've been to several programs where he sounded like Dr. John Hope Franklin. Thank you for your leadership in Congress. I'm going to talk a little about the 1865 Grand Review of the Union Armies. And this review occurred because President Andrew Johnson, felt that less than a month after the murder, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, that it was time for the country to celebrate, to bring the country back together, and to celebrate the great victory and the survival and the success of the Union Army and of the United States of America. And so I'd like to start off, these are words that were written by a historian too, and he pulled up some words from Shakespeare. King Henry V, written by Shakespeare, and you might remember it in a movie or two that you might have heard. It goes like this. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For today, he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. And that's how the men of the 135th United States Colored Troops must have felt on May 24th, 1865, as they marched with pride, honor, and dignity down Pennsylvania Avenue, hearing shouts of praise and applause from the grateful crowds who had come to watch the grand review of the Union Armies. They said there was 250,000 people there, over 150,000 troops. The parade and celebration was so large that it took 2 days to complete. We can only imagine what the men of the 135th must have felt as they received the recognition that they had earned when they passed before President Johnson, the Vice President, the wives, other dignitaries, including Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union forces. They earned that recognition as they assembled and marched in front of the White House. As the only black regiment in the parade, the 135th represented all of the nearly 200,000 black men who had worn Union uniforms and fought to free 4 million of their brothers and sisters held in slavery. It'd been a long march, not just the 300 miles they had traveled by foot from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., but the great distance they had traveled from the day they had decided they would be free, and that they would work and fight to free others, no matter what the cost. They did whatever the cause required of them. First, as pioneer troops, they built roads through swamps and forests, usually at night, often in cold and sometimes under heavy fire. They built roads so that the armies of other men could press forward. But on that day in May, it was their turn to march. Only 2 months earlier, on March 27th, after much hard and courageous service as pioneer troops, they were officially organized into the 135th United States Colored Troops, right here in Goldsboro. As soldiers, they proudly wore their blue uniforms and carried their regimental flag when they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue with the rest of General Sherman's army. Only 1 month earlier, the war had ended. A lot happened in 1865, when President Lincoln had been assassinated. Only a few days after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The nation was thrown into sorrow and despair, particularly the people who had been freed by Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But on that day, the marching men of the 135th lifted their spirits, the spirits of the nation, and made them proud and gave them hope. A report in the New York Times at that time described the grand review of the armies in this way. The last great scene of the war has closed. It has been everything that could impress the senses and stir the imagination. As a military spectacle, it's like, in all probability, will never hereafter be seen on this continent. The thought that fills the mind is not how many soldiers, but what soldiers. It is not because these men are in uniform, but because they are heroes. 100 years later, the torch was passed to a new generation of nonviolent warriors who fought to complete the work of the 135th Regiment. And like them, they marched on Washington. August 28th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King stood before the statue of President Lincoln and said, 100 years later, and the Negro still is not free. But this dream was the same dream of black men who marched in the city in 1865, the same dream of the 135th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Symbolically, the freedom fighters of the 1960s marched on those roads that those men of the 135th had built. And so do we. So do we today. And that is why we are honoring these brave men of the 135th Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. And now at this time, I'd like to introduce Jennifer with the Wayne County Museum. She's got a few things to say.
First of all, thank you all for coming. coming. Thank you so much, Congressman, for being here today. We were really thrilled to be able to host this exhibit and tell the story that's maybe a lesser known aspect of the Civil War history, and to honor these heroes of the 135th, and to shine a light on this chapter of Civil War history, Black history, and local history. We believe all history matters, and we are thrilled to have had this here. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the gentlemen of the 135th research team. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. At this time, I'd like to retire the colors.
Forward, halt! Squad, halt! Left, hey! Present, halt! Order, halt! Right, hey! Forward, halt! Squad, halt! Right, hey! Present, halt! Order, halt! Retreat colors. Right, hey! Forward, halt! Squad, halt! Right, hey! Halt!
Thank you. At this time, I think we acknowledge the descendants that are here attending that are part of the 135th United States Code Troop. They would stand, please, so we can acknowledge them. And thank you all for being part of the 135th USCT research team. So this ends the event here at the museum, but does not end the research that we will continue to do for the 135th USCT. We're planning a memorial here in Goldsboro that we're still working on. That's been in the works for some time now, and we look forward to being able to tell their story and keep it alive so that it doesn't die like it did previously. I want to again thank the museum and thank you all for attending this event and the closing out